Welcome back to Nutrapreneur, the hub for unveiling groundbreaking insights into the nutraceutical industry. I'm your host, Bethany. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Chris Bryant, the director of Bryant Research. Chris leads a team of researchers focused on accelerating the protein transition for the benefit of humanity, animals, and the environment. Bryant Research specializes in social science, market research, and policy analysis to support meat reduction and alternative proteins. Welcome, Chris. It's so great to have you today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Chris, what motivated you to focus on accelerating the protein transition?
Well, for me, the major thing is the treatment of billions of animals in the industrial farming system. It's quite obvious, really, to anyone who thinks about it for a moment, that it's a great moral wrong what happens at massive scale to a massive amount of animals who haven't done anything wrong and definitely have the capacity to feel and so on. And so for me, that is the most important problem to solve today. And alternative proteins are a fantastic way of helping us to do that, because they address the real drivers of people's food choice. Really, people aren't looking at, the ethical considerations of what goes on in the supply chain every time they're trying to buy their lunch, and that's quite understandable. So if you want to address those considerations whilst having a realistic perspective of what drives people's decisions in practice, then having good alternatives to animal products is a really important part of that.
Yes, absolutely. And how has Bryant Research evolved since its inception, and what are some of your key milestones?
Yeah, well, it's been a pretty crazy few years, really. I started Bryant Research as I was finishing up my PhD, which was on a similar topic to a lot of the research we do now. I was looking at consumer perceptions of cell-cultivated meat. We still do a bit of that kind of thing now. But I finished that during COVID, during really the start of the pandemic, and so had lots of time to put into carrying on doing research in this kind of area. At that time, I was working with a couple of cultivated meat companies and was able to carry on during that first year or so of COVID. After a couple of years, so 2022, I hired a couple of people for the first time, two other researchers that joined me initially just for that summer. One of them still works for me. The other went on to work in the UK Government Department of Agriculture and has since gone on to do other interesting related things. But that was a really fantastic experience and really opened up my perception of what could be done at scale, really.
Yes, that's great. And can you discuss more about the significance of your work in supporting meat reduction and the alternative proteins?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, the company, I have always considered it really mainly as a vehicle for doing good for animals, primarily. It's not profit maximizing. It's, mission maximizing, I guess you could call it. The whole team are on board and very much aligned with the mission and where we are trying to push the food system to. And so it's a really important part of what we do. It's really the central thing that we're concerned with achieving. And to that end, we do a lot of work with alternative protein companies and with animal protection non-profits. And we're always trying to do things cheaper and better than the industry standard. We are, all taking lower pay than we might be if we were sort of a conventional profit maximizing company or income maximizing company, in the service of providing additional value for this sector that we all believe in and want to support, particularly when we're working with non-profits. We're able to do things at very affordable rates for them so that we can make the kind of research services that we offer accessible to lots of the organizations in the field, basically.
Yes, that's great. And I think, it's always important for a company to believe in their mission. And, I think it sets a good culture for your company. And then also, that you're trying to find more affordable options. Because I think when it comes to alternative proteins, that industry seems to be growing, but everything you see surrounding it's quite expensive.
That's right. There's definitely a way to go in terms of reducing the prices of these products still. To be honest, I think that's the major stumbling block for a lot of consumers. And you saw, over the last number of years, really exponential growth in the sector from around about 2018 through 2020, 2021. The last couple of years have been a little bit more challenging. I think there's a bit of, regression to the mean going on. But there's also the plant-based market, as you mentioned, has come up against inflation in several markets, which has put a real pressure on people's spending power. The interesting thing about that is that a lot of these products, as you rightly point out, are still more expensive than their animal product counterparts. But we are just about reaching the tipping point in a lot of cases. There are some categories in some countries where the plant-based version is now just a little bit cheaper than the animal version. And it's likely that it's still going to go further in that direction. A lot of the food inflation in the last few years has impacted on animal products more so than on plant-based products, because animal products require more agricultural inputs, right? So if the price of plants goes up, then the price of your plant-based meat inputs goes up, but in fact, you need way more plants as an input for rearing animals. So the price of the animal goes up exponentially. And so for that reason, inflation and the cost of living crisis has been, no doubt about it, in the short term, bad news for the plant-based sector, which, as I say, still it is a little bit more expensive on average. But I think in the longer term is probably going to be the same force that helps plant-based products to get on a level playing field in terms of price. And I think you're increasingly going to see going forward the plant-based products coming in under price of the animal products. And when that happens, I think it'll be the beginning of the end.
Yes, I agree. Thank you for explaining that. And I'm glad we're starting to kind of see the shift in the expense of the plant-based products. And what are some of the most innovative approaches your team has taken in market research and policy analysis for alternative proteins?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's been a great opportunity for policy innovation in the UK. We have just left the European Union, and a lot of our food-related rules and regulations have been inherited from the European Union, but now can be changed and tinkered with. And so there's an opportunity, for example, to make things more efficient for regulating new food products. And the Food Standards Agency in the UK has already started to look at ways of doing that to make the UK sort of competitive with other countries on a global level. So there are several fights to be fought on the policy front. One is about product labeling. That is always something that is in contention, sort of perennially pushed by the animal industries. I think it's fair to say that, plant-based milk shouldn't be allowed to be called milk and so on. Already in the UK, you won't find any oat milk, only oat drink in the supermarket, right? Which, of course, we all call it oat milk colloquially. And the claim has always been that consumers might be confused by this kind of labeling. There's a lot of evidence at this point, which polling and experiments are really good for finding this kind of thing out and actually testing these kind of claims, that, what a surprise, consumers are not confused by terms like oat milk. They actually largely understand that this means that it's come from oats and not from a cow. So, yes, the grounds that this kind of labeling is somehow misleading, I think, has started to fall apart, and you've started to see some of the proponents of those kind of labeling restrictions relying on other things. So there's a couple of things that we've been working on in the policy sphere. We also, as you mentioned, do consumer research and kind of behavior change research. So we're always looking at new ways of trying to get data on what people are eating and what food choices that people are making, in fact. We recently partnered with a cafe in Edinburgh in Scotland, and we made some vouchers for them. They didn't have a voucher system, but we went and made some and then bought them from them. So we had effectively paid in advance for a bunch of meals, which we now had these vouchers, which we could distribute, and they would redeem for either a meat-based or a vegetarian sandwich. Now, upstream of that, we then had our intervention. In this case, was a presentation that was shown to some people, but not others. Right? Everyone gets a voucher. You know which vouchers are associated with which video, and then afterwards, you can go to the cafe who's been recording whether the voucher was redeemed for a meat or a vegetarian sandwich and see if there's a higher proportion of vegetarian things in the video that you're testing out. And we found that to be, a really good way of actually getting a measure on a real food choice as opposed to kind of a self-reported survey answer about what you intend to do and so on. And actually that approach yielded a very big effect size. So we're likely going to publish that data. It's very exciting stuff. But we're always looking at those kind of new ways of getting at data to help inform the question of how we can start to push more people away from animal products and towards alternatives.
This episode is brought to you by NutraPayments.com. If your business needs credit card processing that fully integrates with most major Nutra software platforms, offers the lowest industry prices, and has built-in features like recurring billing, $0 trials, and chargeback prevention, then visit us at NutraPayments.com for a free online quote. Yes, absolutely. No, that's great that you're doing that research, and it sounds like the data you're collecting is really helpful to identify where we're at right now.
I hope so. Yeah. We tried to track some of the dietary choices and major attitudes that people have over time as well. We have an annual summer survey where we take a sort of cross-section of the UK in terms of their attitudes towards meat reduction and, other related issues. And that's something that we work on each year. We get a bunch of partners to suggest questions so that we can help to, track some of the important metrics. But there's really a bunch of projects that we work on across the board in terms of political advocacy, but also on a more individual level, testing out interventions, messaging, as well as like product packaging and things like that. So there's a really exciting range of things. There's 7 of us on the team now. So yeah, it's all going on.
Yes. And you've kind of touched on this a bit already, but can you highlight a few significant findings from your research that have influenced the alternative protein industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So we wrote a policy report a couple of years ago with a view to the reforms going on post-Brexit. And many of the recommendations that we put forward in that report have been taken forward in some form or another, or are still being considered to be taken forward. There's some really common sense things that we were advocating for on behalf of the alternative proteins industry. This was things like the regulator giving clarity on some issues where there was no clarity, and starting a sort of dialogue with the industry where there was no dialogue. And both those things have been done. The FSA is in a much better position than EFSA, which is the European equivalent. There's also been some attempts at streamlining the process. For example, they currently have the requirements for existing approved foods to have their approval renewed every 10 years. But they're looking at removing that requirement, which is going to remove a big backlog of their work. And there are other mechanisms and requirements for kind of alerting the authorities if there would be some sort of cause for thinking that a renewal is required. So it's just kind of technical things like that that can help to make it more efficient. There's also been progress made in other aspects as well. The UK government has started to fund more research in the fields of alternative proteins, which is something, a drum that we've been always banging, right, to try to get more funding into the sector. And in particular, we're looking at some of the funding mechanisms that might be particularly politically feasible and particularly politically acceptable to the farming sector, for example. So Canada, the government in Canada invested 100 million Canadian dollars into a food technology company called Merit Functional Foods. And it was on the condition that that company would use 100% Canadian crops in their products. So here we had a company that was, producing meat alternatives and perhaps going to cause some concern for the farming community in Canada. And this was a way for the government to say, we can make this work for our domestic producers and farmers, right, as well as food companies. So we're looking at a number of policies that can help to make what we call a just transition a reality, and make the shift away from animal products not one that has to be economically painful for the people who currently rely on animal farming, in terms of producing other opportunities for those people to pursue, and in particular a lot of government supports in terms of financial support, also retraining and reskilling programs, things like that. But there's a lot of that stuff going on, on the policy side. Let me take a look at some of our latest things that we've been putting out on the research side. One interesting thing that we just put out a couple of days ago is about the misrepresentation of farmers' problems as being about alternative proteins, when in fact they're about intensive farming. And if you look at the number of farming jobs and the quantity of meat produced, they don't correlate as one would think if the reducing farming jobs was being caused by a reduction in meat consumption, right? So it is true that the number of agricultural jobs has been on a steady decline, but it is not a result of meat consumption going down, because at the same time as that has happened, meat consumption's been steadily increasing. So the graphs, sort of an X like this crossing over. Now that wouldn't be happening if the agricultural jobs going away was due to falling meat consumption, right? You would see them going in the same direction. And indeed, big farming lobbies have really been appropriating the struggle of the small farmers, which they have largely been causing, again, by intensification of their farms and undercutting smaller farms and integrating them and taking them over and having people. Yeah, there are fewer farming jobs. There are worse farming jobs, right? Nobody prefers to work on the factory farm rather than the sort of small scale farm that they were on previously, perhaps. So essentially you have these large agricultural companies acquiring farms, making them intensive, which causes fewer and worse farming jobs. And then those companies organising and saying that the farmers' woes are being caused by alternative proteins, when really that has nothing to do with it. And that's why you're seeing a lot of political action around that now. You have Florida and Italy are the states in the US and in Europe, respectively, which have banned cultivated meat, right? Which is an alarmingly stupid policy, frankly. But there we go.
Yes. And so when you're conducting your research, how do you ensure the accuracy and reliability of the data, and what challenges do you face in this process?
Yeah, so when we are doing original data collection, we're using either surveys or experimental surveys sometimes, or focus groups typically. So on the survey side, we have a number of ways of filtering for good responses. We'll have attention check questions that we use in our surveys, which are standardized, but will also vary. And as they are not these days very AI proof, you can also have capture and other things like that, which are ensuring that the data you get is, of a good quality. We're usually finding that once we take out people who have failed attention checks, who have gone through a survey too quickly, or who have pinged a number of other quality check flags, once we take those people out, there's often a reassuring sort of 15% reduction in the sample, right? You don't want your quality checks to be either too broad or too narrow. So that's roughly the process on the survey side. On the qualitative side, it's much more about accounting for one's own role and direction. So it's trying to not influence the conversation in a focus group too heavily one way or another by sort of suggesting or sharing one's own view. Now, we have had focus groups where they've Googled our views and then been upset with us sometimes, right? Yeah, the idea is that you'll be guiding the conversation topics, but not tone or direction. Mm-hmm. So that's more like the challenge on the qualitative side in terms of data quality and reflexivity, they call that.
Yes. Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of challenges along the way. And what advice do you have for new researchers and companies entering the alternative protein space?
Yeah, good question. For new researchers, I would say, I mean, this is quite easy advice that anyone will tell you, I suppose, but publishing as much as you can, as early as you can, is really going to help you, because it becomes anything that you have published with your name on it becomes an advert for you, and then other people can find you with opportunities. And eventually you will have, the choice of which opportunities you say yes to, because you'll have so many of them because of all your publications, right? So publishing as much as you can, as early as you can, I think is really, really good advice. Don't feel like you're not allowed to submit a paper. I remember the first time I submitted a paper thinking, wow, little old me couldn't possibly be allowed to do this, right? But alas, you are, and scientists and peer reviewers and journal editors are all fallible humans and, breathe and bleed like you and I. So don't be scared by the facade of the ivory tower, right? Peer reviewers are just lazy, distracted people with unread emails, like to the rest of us, right? So, don't take the process too seriously and allow it to put you off. That would be my major advice for early career researchers. For alternative protein companies, I think that there's been some interesting discourse in the past year or so about whether this conventional wisdom that price and taste are the most important factors to maximize is really accurate. I think that is accurate. I think it's fairly obvious and self-evident, although I think there is, in fact, other evidence that price and taste, eating quality, subjective enjoyment of consuming are very important predictors of how likely people are to buy a product. But they're not the only things that matter. And so in the context of the protein transition, you could have the perfect meat alternatives, but unless people feel that they have a good reason to stop eating meat, they're not going to be compelled to switch. So I think of this in terms of push factors and pull factors. You'll have push factors pushing away from animal products, images of factory farms, for example. And then you'll have pull factors pulling towards alternatives. So the push and the pull are going in the same direction here. So increasingly good alternatives are the pull factors, and then animal advocacy and diet change advocacy are the push factors. And I think really you need both, because from the push side, when you're the animal advocate, you want people to have very good alternatives so that you can say, look, it's not going to be that much effort to change, not that much of a sacrifice. And of course, from the alternative protein side, you want the animal advocates to be unapologetically putting in front of people the reasons why they really should be changing, particularly if you're in, a marketing department at a meat alternative company who might be squeamish about using the kind of imagery which is sometimes required to push people along, right? Then, yes, certainly both sides are sort of mutually benefiting from each other in that sense.
Yes. And when it comes to policy analysis, how do you see this shaping the future of meat reduction and alternative proteins?
I think that alternative proteins is a really important presence in meat reduction policy. It's very difficult to make any headway politically when we're talking about reducing anything, frankly. No one wants to do less of anything. Everyone wants to do more of everything, right? And that is a problem for lots of climate campaigners, right? Where it's about trying to reduce activity that's greenhouse gas intensive, but that activity is good for the economy. So what do you do, right? Insofar as you're going to politicians and saying, look, we need to do less animal farming and everyone needs to eat less meat and so on, that's quite a difficult conversation to have and to make progress on. But if you can go with a affirmative sector that you're advocating for in alternative proteins and say, look, there are these British companies or American companies that are providing jobs and an increasingly important sector of the economy and so on, and can export products and all of these benefits that governments will like to hear about. Now you can advocate for the growth of a sector and not just the shrinking of a sector. I think it's a really, really important frame change in terms of political advocacy to have the alternative protein sector as something that we can advocate for and not just against.
Yes. And lastly, I'd like to talk about the future a little bit. So are there any upcoming projects or initiatives from Bryant Research that you're particularly excited about and can share with our listeners?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's so many cool things that we're working on. Let me see which of these I'm allowed to share with you. We are doing more and more political facing stuff, which I think is useful and something that I'm keen to be spending more time on. So that's something that we're going to be developing. We are also doing more and more modeling. So what would be the impacts of a change in meat consumption? What would be, the impacts of different sort of levels of policy change or of consumption change and so on. So that's actually an evolution from what we've traditionally done, which is mostly consumer surveys and focus groups and kind of the empirical consumer studies, really. But now we're shifting, I think, a little bit to focus on policy and politics and institutional interventions as well. So there's and also on modelling and helping to demonstrate the benefits of certain transitions. So yeah, there's a real evolution of what we've been involved with. And I think that we will continue to evolve that. And I think really we're all here to try to provide value for the sector, and that's what we're most interested in doing. So if we find the new ways that we can start to do that with our skill sets and expertise, which is quite wide ranging and touched on a number of different topics related to this, then we're always keen to employ that and make it happen. So yeah, watch this space. More to come from Bryant Research, I'm sure.
Yes, yes. We're very excited to see where it goes. So, wrapping up our insightful discussion, we've explored the pivotal role of Bryant Research in advancing the protein transition. We have the deepest gratitude for Chris Bryant for sharing his valuable experiences and perspectives. For listeners that are eager to learn more about Bryant Research or explore its publications and services, we've provided the necessary links. Do subscribe, share your thoughts, and join us in spotlighting the nutraceutical world on social media. Until our next episode, stay informed and inspired by the innovations in nutraceuticals.